Jasodhara I have known, and I keep saying this actually every time I get, people must certainly would accuse me of nepotism, and in a way it's true. Every faculty member is a friend of mine, but I have known her for several years. She has, in South Asia, certainly been one of the gurus that I have learned from, and certainly someone I have turned to at many moments of despair regarding this very institute. Jasodhara was part of the planning process and a member of the faculty that met in 1997 to finalize the content and methodology of the course. Unfortunately, because of 2 consecutive operations, she was not able to come and teach in the last 2 programs. I am delighted to have her with us this year. Dr. Bagchi was previously the Professor of English and Director of Women's Studies, Jasodhara University, Calcutta. She is an activist in the Indian women's movement and a founder member of a women's activist organization, Sachetna. Jasodhara has done extensive research in the interface of gender, culture and development issues and edited Indian Women, Myth and Reality. She will be speaking on the politics of culture, the culture of politics and the politics of culture. The format, incidentally, for today is that Jasodhara will speak. Immediately after that, Portia will speak. We will then open it up for discussion, where both of them will be here for both the comments and the question and answer sessions, after which, of course, you're invited for tea. I welcome Dr. Jasodhara Bagchi. I'm sorry for this mistake.
Respected guests, my colleagues and friends with ASR Institute of Women's Studies, and dear students. Forgive me, coming from Bengal, if I begin with a snippet of a song by Rabindranath Tagore, because this is what has been going on in my mind for the last week since I've been here. যেন পেরিয়েলেন অন্তরীণ আসিতে তোমার দ্বারে মনে হল মরুভূমির হতে সুধা শ্যামলের পারে মনে হল। It feels as if I've crossed an endless path to come to your doorstep, crossing the desert sands to get to the green verge. This has been my experience, crossing the border. I am deeply overwhelmed by this occasion made possible by the ASR Institute of Women's Studies, Lahore. I'd like to begin by paying my tribute to this institute and to my very dear friend Nizaki in particular, and the ways in which it has realized the dream of putting together a course in women's studies that address the material reality of women's lives, their aspirations, addressing the question of patriarchy through its accretions down the different modes of production, and helping us to locate it within the present political juncture. I bring to you, as we say in Bengali, greetings in struggle. From all the present, friends who share a common sense of struggle to keep our dreams of a just and egalitarian society alive. The feminists, old and new, are waiting eagerly for me to take back to them messages from you of our joint struggle. I am deeply grateful to the Institute and to ASR for this opportunity to interact with an audience outside my classroom. First, I have to locate myself within the context of culture and explain to you where I am speaking from. My first and immediate context is West Bengal. I say this with a sense of challenge and pride that even to this day it offers a climate of resistant culture, a culture that is still able to say no to various renewing patterns of domination through which the social inequality and social justice are being perpetrated and perpetuated. The culture of politics within which I grew up from my student days was one in which culture was harnessed to political movements that were left-oriented, critical of the class domination, especially as it emerged after the independence. On the subject that I have chosen to broach before you, there is so much to share that I found it difficult to cut through a coherent area of presentation. In order to make sense, I have chosen a few critical moments and a few texts. I have located most of this discourse in the recent colonial past. But this past is invoked as the urgent prehistory of the present, to signal to the challenges of our dark, confusing times. As my colleague Malini Bhattacharya quoted a few years ago, a few very apt lines from Bertolt Brecht. In the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. I shall be presenting from an area of study that is complex. I'll be drawing upon extremely fine work done by fellow feminists in a spirit of solidarity, such as Uma Chakravarti, Kumkum Sangari, Tonika Sarkar, Malini Bhattacharya, and several others, whom I cannot acknowledge adequately. Though I focus my work on Bengal, but I really address the issue of post-colonial societies in a newly recolonizing world. If I have reread Tagore for my presentation, it is meant to be an activist reading to demonstrate the ways in which culture of politics may be retrieved, transformed, and extended. Let me try and historicize this domain of culture, as it has emerged as a handmaiden of the political consciousness, particularly of my site in Bengal. My approach to this area will be rooted through the women's movement that has prompted a critical view of the gendered look of the cultural images that have been transmitted to us. Bengal has been the scene of an extremely broad-based left democratic fight for a very long time. It was the scene of militant fight against the British rulers, along with Punjab, that had been derogatorily recalled the terrorist fight against the British. The two major militant groups called Jugantar and Anushilon had members who could not identify when the movement was over, they could not identify with the centrist policy of the mainstream Nationalist Congress and turned to communist or other revolutionary groups. For instance, in 1940 in Bengal itself, the Revolutionary Socialist Party was founded. And we also had the Forward Bloc, which was formed under that inspiration of Subhash Chandra Bose. Actually, these are the main components of our left for the last 23 years. The cultural experiments brought about in the political climate was anchored on an anger against people's exploitation. This sometimes produced paradoxical results. Even when the communists officially did not oppose the British, because they were meant to be fighting a people's war, their women's wing had formed the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti that mobilized the women in rural Bengal, especially Biden East Bengal, to fight the devastation wreaked by Bengal famine, which as you know was an imperialist ploy, and the other forms of social injustice that it generated. It is to raise funds for the famous famine relief, again, that the cultural squad of the Indian People's Theatrical Association, IPTA for short, was formed. Within a few years, it became an all-India movement that drew progressive-minded performing artists and literatures from all over. This had certainly laid the foundation of a secular culture that was anti-fascist, anti-imperialist, left democratic. And I am very happy to be speaking about this in a site which was deeply involved. This was a time when what Raymond Williams called the emergent culture was harnessed to the call of social transformation. And it was a transformation that could not afford not to address the needs of the downtrodden, exploited, and the working class. I am in full agreement with my colleague Malini Bhattacharya when she signaled a few years ago, quote, "For a long time since the emergence of India as an independent state, ideas like democracy, egalitarianism, self-sufficiency, economic planning, secularism, and socialism have served as terms of reference for certain relationships within our political space. These have described the parameters of gender and cultural issues too." Unquote. This climate of democratic, secular, and socialist politics that informed the basic social relationships in India till the end of the 80s was aligned to an attempt on the part of the ruling classes to keep to an economic order that, in spite of limitations of class domination, was committed to a certain fostering of an indigenous bourgeois class and a minimal commitment to a redistributive justice. The commitment was rolled back from the early 90s and has meant that it has been an ever more uphill task to keep alive a certain commitment to left democratic socialist values. Although Marx in the Critique of Political Economy had said that while material transformation of the economic conditions of production can be determined with precision of natural science, the superstructure of forms such as legal, political, religious, aesthetic or philosophic that make up the world of culture, through which human beings articulate their consciousness, remains a conflictual domain to be fought out. Thus, politics that purports to be transformative of social life needs to have a cultural apparatus that is not only, to use Raymond Williams' terms, emergent, but it also has to refuse to be incorporated. That is to say, co-opted within the dominant system of exploitation. The hegemony, in Gramscian sense, could use culture to bring about the political transformation that needed organic intellectuals, who could then go on to change the common sense of people. Hegemony in this sense of non-coercive consensus building was not meant to be a supine submission to the dominant ideology of the ruling class, but a cultural intervention to fight out the recalcitrant forces of oppression and exploitation in a class society. Bengal, I may remind you, has always stood at an angle to the main seats of power vis-à-vis the rest of India. And it has had a long tradition of dissidence. It never fitted in with ease within the Brahmanical fold, having had a long stretch of Buddhist rule, then Muslim rule, in the middle of which we have the Bhakti movement that further untied the shackles of orthodoxy imposed by Brahmanism. Thus, Bengal always had the reputation of remaining outside the fold of pure Brahmanical culture as the rest of North India. Being one of the earliest parts of India to come under British colonialism, the challenge to Hindu Brahmanical practice was sounded yet again in Bengal in the vigorous campaign for social reform. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whose campaign for prevention of widow immolation or Shotidaho was based on arguments about natural justice, derived as much from Western Enlightenment notions of reason and equality as from Islamic notions of humanism, with which he had engaged quite seriously before he turned to English. So those who feel disturbed by reason as a Western colonial invasion of our indigenous psyche would do well to look at some of the earlier form that certainly predates the British colonial era. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who learnt English later in life, was already a fully fledged thinker when he engaged with the colonial rulers and the Hindu Pandits, who were the native informants of Western rulers who legislated in order to govern the so-called uncivilized barbarian Indians. Women's movements would do well to remember that the freeing of human reason and human nature that we ascribe to European Enlightenment was not merely copied by the indigenous intellectual leaders. In the current fashion of postmodernist, post-colonial critique that has been mounted, especially in the North American academia, it is oversimplistically assumed that all education and the notions of humanism attended upon it produced a mimic man, who were Indian in dress and habit, but English in taste, who were going to listen to his master's voice and translate it for their own lesser brethren. But it did not quite happen that way. The momentum generated by new knowledge or education always exceeds the boundaries set by education itself. It produces its own rebellions, its own revolt. This was to be demonstrated in one of the early institutions of higher learning in Calcutta, which was, by the way, not a gift of the British, but was the result of efforts by the indigenous elite. I am talking of Hindu College, founded in 1817, that was recognized as Presidency College by the British state many years later in 1855, and in which I was an undergraduate when its centenary was being celebrated in 1955. The complexity of complicity and resistance that was thrown up by such institutions is something that we have to keep in mind when we judge the culture of resistance that accompanies the class formation that even a limited colonial society permits. A young Eurasian poet, Henry Louis Vivian Desrosiers, inspired a number of young students to start a movement of free thinking. They were dubbed Young Bengal, and even their limited questioning united a section of Hindu orthodoxy against them. If we look at the critique of Young Bengal that was mounted by the Hindu orthodoxy, we find that the obedience and docility to the colonial master was articulated by the Hindu Babu, and the challenge to the social order with all the limitations of the colonial society came from precisely the section which was supposed to have critiqued their own society in the light of ideas which they commandeered from Western sources. In a satirical disquisition on the manners and customs of Young Bengal, the Hindu Babu were the we, and the angry Young Bengal represented the they. And the list went like this: we, sober and calm; they, headstrong and precipitate; we, deliberate and firm; they, rash and fickle; we, polite and wise; they, unruly and lavish; we, dispassionate and assuage; they, furious and polemical. This is, you realize, the voice of a dominant normative culture, the purveyor of order, ever under the tutelage of the colonial master, taking on a hegemonic role, even though it was hopelessly hegemonized. The dynamics thrown up by culture cannot simply be explained by the economic base alone. It throws up challenges and builds up its own resistant edges, even from within its fissures and contradictions. This is where a distinctly political culture is born. Such a culture is not afraid to use critical tools that are not necessarily indigenous, confined within the false consciousness of an identity based on a notion of religion-based community that in any case was a category of ruling, used first for administering legal governance and eventually used for dividing in order to rule better according to the interest of the colonial master. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's campaign for widow remarriage in 1856 may have been flawed by the fear of uncontrolled female sexuality and the need to contain them within the safe fold of domesticity, but nevertheless, it sent shockwaves through the fold of Brahmanical orthodoxy. Combined with his untiring campaign for sending girls to school, it definitely meant an opening up of spaces for women, which once opened up could not possibly be kept within the narrow confines of domesticity. Bengal produced the first women graduates in the British Empire. One of them went on to train for medical profession. By the turn of the century, we have the unmistakable voice of Begum Rokeya Sakhawat Hussain, who was demanding rights for women not as a supplicant, but as a creator of a feminist utopia. Sultana's Dream, originally written in English, that you perhaps know, talked about the public realm as belonging to women and the private to men. It is interesting to note that Begum Rokeya's text is written nearly at the same time as Charlotte Perkins Gilman, one of the early feminist writers in America, produced her famous utopia called Her Land. By 1927, women on the subcontinent had formed their own organization, All India Women's Conference. You can see the range and outreach of this impulse in the wonderful photograph of the Asian Women's Conference that took place in 1931 that ASR brought out a photograph of in, I think, 1995, if I'm not mistaken. Throughout this period, women were writing on all kinds of subjects. Rabindranath Tagore's elder sister, Swarna Kumari Devi, edited a very high-powered journal called Bharati, and herself wrote not only fiction and short stories, but discursive writings and writings on popular science. As Susie Tharu and K. Lalita's gorgeous anthology brings out, women were writing and exploring their multiple identities, often in response to what was happening in the public realm. In protest against the attempted partition of Bengal in 1905, the women of Bengal devised their own unique form of protest. It was going to be orandhon, that is no cooking. That's how they protested. Despite Partha Chatterjee's diagnosis of the nationalist resolution of the woman question in the oft-quoted essay from the famous volume called Recasting Women, it was very clear that the woman question had come to stay. It was not prepared to be resolved in any simplistic way. With all the contradictions attendant upon it, women were going to intervene in the public realm and were not going to push back to their homes to become domestic drudges. Even homes which had reading, writing women in them became explosive sites of cultural contestation. Already in the 19th century, women were waking up to the possibilities of class subjectivity and no longer remained confined to the object status of mere victimhood. One of the most challenging cultural artifacts of this emergent class was a text like Rasa Sundari Devi's Amar Jiban, My Life, the first women's autobiography in Bengali, now beautifully translated and introduced by one of our foremost feminist scholars, Sonuta Kotta. Along with that, we have the memoirs of Vinod, the famous actress who got seriously involved with the nationalist agenda with the Bengali state, and this has also been translated and very well edited by Rimdi Bhattacharya. The world of theatrical performance was still taboo for the new woman with bourgeois aspirations. But meanwhile, Rabindranath Tagore had opened up the world of performing arts to the Bhadra Mahila of Bengal. He composed music which certainly brought it within the reach of homes, but in his school at Shantiniketan, there were young women who were waking up to the possibilities of their own bodies and expressing their desire to them through dance drama. Now we have on record Professor Amartya Sen's octogenarian mother writing on the sense of liberation that she enjoyed through the culture of dance and music that Rabindranath Tagore brought into the new system of education in his own school in Shantiniketan. Creation of a gendered space in the sphere of culture went with a secular democratic impulse that made Rabindranath Tagore suspicious of narrowly conceived spirit of nationalism that he realized had been unleashed through the spirit of a nationalism that was going to essentialize religion and the notion of womanhood as harnessed to the services of the building of a nation state. In Ghore Baire, The Home and the World, made into such a beautiful film by Satyajit Ray, which has a memorable visualization of the passage of the woman, the heroine, from the Andar Mahal, the inner domain, to the outer domain, where she meets a militant nationalist leader, Shondeep. With his aggressively Hinduized nationalism, Shondeep camouflages his sexual attraction towards the heroine behind an essentialist image of the nation seen as a Hindu woman. The process of essentialization is not only an imposition from the communally articulated nationalism of Shondeep, the Hindu nationalist, but the sexual innuendo that Tagore had built into the self-perception of the heroine. The situation is a political one. The militant nationalist leader speaking in the Zamindar household, the Zamindar's wife Vimola is permitted to come and listen to him. When their eyes meet, Vimola's comment is, was I then an inmate of an aristocratic family? I was then the only representative of the Bengali womanhood. He was then the hero of Bengal. Just as the rays of the sun had fallen on his forehead, so he needed to be crowned by a woman's heart. How else will he attain fulfillment on his great journey, she asked. It's an ambivalent kind of statement. This is a fictional ploy to expose the false essentializing impulse of a Hinduized nationalism, which did not hesitate to exploit poor peasants who were mostly Muslims. This helped to unleash forces of deep hatred, thereby providing an internal sanction to Curzon's policy of divide and rule, against which these Swadeshi Babus were supposed to be fighting. An old village school teacher in the novel acts as the voice of conscience when he accuses the Hindu Bhadralok nationalists looking after their narrow class interests. He says, "You earn the merits of the penance, while the poor peasants do the fast for you." In his famous indictment of nationalism, Tagore makes a distinction between two types of Western influence. The first, which he calls the nation of the West, which according to him manifests itself in these macho nationalisms, blind to the ground reality within which they choose to work. He contrasts it with the spirit of the West, from which it is possible to borrow tools for social critique. Taking this cue from Tagore, I would like to take on a certain trend in current cultural studies and examine its impact on our reading of the culture of politics. The political perspective from which I shall take up this brief excursus will be feminist and socialist. The postmodernist, post-structuralist trends in current discourse on culture have emphasized difference rather than commonality. This has meant that universalism in any form has tended to be dismissed as tyrannical and authoritarian, attempting to smother specific identities of individuals, groups, even those who aspire to future nationhood. While cultural theories are busy equating universalism with the politics of authoritarianism, and thereby overthrowing many valuable insights that rely on an internationalist terrain of intervention, such as Marxist, socialist, and even contesting forms of humanism, which has not been sufficiently emphasized as the hidden agenda of difference that has within it. The potential for reifying identity, making it into an object, opening out the possibilities of manipulation by coercive hidden powers, has been, I would claim, is this kind of secret agenda. With his firm commitment to the vicissitudes of Indian history and society, it was perhaps this manipulative role of identity that made Tagore uneasy in the heyday of Hindu nationalism. The manipulative role was based on a facile generalization that it is through a sustained principle of difference from the colonial masters that the resistance to colonial rule may be articulated. A kind of identity-based indigenism came to be considered the element to fall back upon, as I've argued in a piece published in a volume edited by Kumari Jayawardena, with whom we first discussed this institute, that a myth of chaste heroism built around the image of the pure upper caste Hindu woman was the main staple behind this Hindu nationalist articulation. But what it signaled was something that had more far-reaching effect. The so-called universalist principles that were borrowed from the civil society of the colonizers, when transported to the domain of colonial domination, were articulated on principles of cultural relativism. In trying to codify the civil laws of India, the British administrators relied on native informants chosen according to religious communities. Thus, whether or not an individual was religious, in the eyes of the civil law, she or he was constituted as belonging to this or that religious community. Identity grounded on that of a religious community was used as a weapon against the masters during the anti-colonial resistance. Here comes the paradox, that in the name of fighting colonial domination, the nationalists chose as their weapon precisely the element that the colonial masters had devised as a ruling category, namely religious identity. Having fixed the identities of the two major communities in religious terms, the imperialist game was to play one off against the other. But one needs to address the complexity of the ways in which the Enlightenment notion of reason actually operated in a society that was fraught with all the contradictions of class. The reason at one level tried to expunge all that appeared as the alien and the other. The other extended from women, native indigenous peoples, Dalits, to working class, minority community, tribal. With this other phase, however, this is something I would like to emphasize. It is precisely these categories that reason released, offering possibilities of equality and liberty. It gave them hope of coming on their own. This was the revolutionary reason. that helped to move the feudal accretion and usher in the democratic potential through the early years of capitalism. This is the transformative potential captured in the Communist Manifesto and has been extensively discussed and illustrated by a scholar like Eric Hobsbawm in The Age of Revolution. By one of the ironies of history, the experiment of colonization by the British cashed in on the euphoria of the forward thrust of industrial revolution. What was liberating as an ideology for the British rulers, however, became a source of thraldom for the colony. The ideological state apparatus, to use Althusser's later term, provided by education, law and administrative apparatus, was an effective camouflage for the real commercial design on reducing India to a mere producer of raw materials, feeding the industrial revolution in Britain, which in its turn was going to produce the finished goods for which India then became the captive market. While in its own society, the argument of douce commerce or sweet commerce freed the common man from feudal bondage into the relative maneuverability of an industrial society. It sucked the blood out of the ordinary Indian cultivator and artisan. This was the political economy of underdevelopment, within which the politics of anti-colonial resistance had to be played out. The tools of analysis of cultural representation that was thrown up by the feminist movement have been very effective in our understanding of this politics that got built around culture. The ways in which literature, visual arts and performing arts, as well as music, picked up the feminine images have provided extremely compelling critical tools for unpacking this political use of culture. As an illustration of this fairly complex terrain, analyzed very richly by our feminist friends, I shall briefly touch upon the political use of the ideology of motherhood at a crucial moment in the nationalist awakening of Bengal. Patriarchy, whether in its modern or more traditional form, constantly tries to glorify motherhood as the most prized vocation for women. If we, however, focus on the way the ideology of motherhood was picked up to represent the nationalist appropriation of the cultural life, we discover the power of culture as a political force. As a phenomenon, it deserves special attention because at one go, religion, cultural and aesthetic domains get politicized. I'd like to communicate to you the power of this by singing to you parts of the song that became the mantra of Indian nationalism. The reason it was not acceptable as a national anthem was because of its strong Hindu overtones. Vande Mataram Sujala Sukhala Malaya Shitala Shasya Shamala Mataram Shubhra Jyotsna Pulakita Yamini Phulla Kusumita Drumagala Shobhini Suhasini Sumadhura Bhashini Sukhadang Baradang Mataram Vande Mataram. This is more or less a rendering of the physical plenitude of a benign mother, well-watered, fertile, smiling in clear moonlight, using the Sanskritic form of a Hindu mother. Suddenly the mood changes, and the speech registers change to Bengali. 30 crores of anguished voices and twice 30 crores of shackled hands. Why is the mother with all her might reduced to such powerlessness? Trinchakoti kantha kala kala ninad karale Vitrinchakoti bhujai dhita khara khara bale Obola kanuma eto bole. But she is the many-armed goddess Durga, who rescues the world and saves her sons from the snares of the senses, Therefore, one has to bow to her. Bahubaladharini, namami tarini, ripudalavarini, mataram, bande mataram. Please note, among others, the covert reference to female sexuality. Ripudalavarini, she is the one who prevents you from falling into snares of the senses. In a hymn that is supposed to celebrate women's dreams. This is precisely the way in which culture is reified. By essentializing the feminine image of motherhood, it gradually shifts its ground from the terrain of material exploitation, of class, gender, ethnicity, and enters an encapsulated form in which a retrogressive, atavistic indigenism pulls back the entire political scenario. The mythical empowerment of women through culture that entered the politics of nationalism is a very complex phenomenon and can be demonstrated from the perspective of the major community, all the communities. I have only used here the case of Vande Mataram as an extremely telling one, but I am sure if we feminists all over the post-colonial world put up a concerted effort, we can come up with an elaborate map of the politics of cultural representation. Unfortunately, what goes in the name of post-colonial critique has followed the postmodernist demonizing of reason as the agent only of colonialism. While it is naively apolitical, not to question the agenda of the universalist claims of modernity and progress behind the civilizing mission of colonialism, it is dangerous politics to take shelter behind indigenous traditions of authenticity as the only way to fight what is considered Western domination. The third strand, apart from these two, the third strand, which is much more difficult to retrieve, is the one that can reinscribe class, caste, gender, religious identity as areas of contestation, which could then locate a more politically articulated identity outside the surveillance of religion. Instead of a wishy-washy multiculturalism as the basis of secular democracy, we should stake our claims on identities based on subjectivity and agency that is prepared to enter into collectivities that extend well beyond the interpellation of religious identity. It is this that can capture the marginalized groups that are excluded by the dominant ideology in the name of dominant religion. It is this difficult choice that Tagore tries to work out in his famous novel, Gora, literally meaning the white boy. Gora is really an orphan of Irish parents who had died during the mutiny of 1857 and is then brought up by kindly Brahmin parents. By extrapolating the time frame, he makes Gora a practitioner of Hindu nationalism that I have already shown Tagore criticizing in Ghore Baile. Not knowing the secret of his own birth, Gora takes on exaggerated Brahminical ritual purity as the sign of his political commitment to his motherland. In his tours through the villages where he is spreading the gospel of militant Swadeshi, he faces his first moment of doubt when he has to refuse the hospitality of a good Brahmin because he has committed the ritual sin of giving shelter to a Muslim boy who really needed it. And Gora has to accept the hospitality from a Brahmin who is tyrannical and quite clearly dishonest and comprador. So Gora meditates, quote, what desecration we are perpetuating by making purity an entirely external event. Is the perpetrator who is victimizing the poor Muslim the man in whose hands my caste purity is safe? And the good man who is giving shelter to the Muslim boy, even at the risk of social ostracization, the man I shun for fear of caste pollution? Unquote. Tagore himself at once made a distinction between religion and theocracy. Religion for him has the natural ebb and flow of human life, whereas theocracy, in our case corresponding to Hindutva, stood for a clogging up of blood vessels. One must remember that religion and theocracy, he says, I'm quoting, are not the same thing. Religion says, if you do not respect human beings, neither the abuser nor the abused find happiness. Theocracy lays it down that a man is an infidel if he cannot elaborately follow the rules of humiliating man mercilessly. Religion says, Those who make living beings suffer needlessly kill souls. Theocracy says, however great the suffering, the parents who serve food and water to the widowed daughters on special days of the lunar month nurture sin. Unquote. On this potent theme, many women writers join the male writers in depicting the misery of young upper caste widows of Bengal, a theme, surprising enough, that is today being considered for banning as anti-national. Such is the force of theocracy. As opposed to this recent grotesque manifestation of the politics of culture, Tagore does succeed in harnessing culture to the cause of secular democratic thinking. Going against the nationalist grain of essentialized, mythicized motherhood, Gora's mother Anandamoyi is portrayed with a different kind of inner strength. While feeling guilty for having inducted an infidel boy into the household, the father had taken shelter behind, Brahminical rituals. The mother, however, had resolutely refused to practice any ritualistic exclusion. She is a memorable cultural presentation of a rational mother, shorn of ideological trappings of false indigenism, responding to human beings without doctrinal refutation. Feminist literary theory has talked about handling of writing about women and of women writing. What Tagore has presented through his cultural representation of Gora's mother is corroborated in the women writers who were writing at the turn of the century. Many of them without any formal schooling, their engagement with women's issues, their deprivation, their awareness of the deprivation and the gender division of spheres were written out about most eloquently. They protested about being denied the public realm and their exposure of the complicity of families in keeping them confined and tortures attendant on it were extremely urgent and real. Turning back to Gora, the secular outlook that Gora regains at the end, having discarded his politics based on Brahminical identity, is not just a narrative ploy, a happy ending that rounds things up in a spirit of reconciliation. If one reads the novel Gora in conjunction with the discursive prose that Tagore was writing throughout the first and second decades of this century, we see him fighting religious identity as a basis of political life, while repeatedly harping on the importance of the search for self-identity. He searched for an identity that is inclusive and indigenous at the same time. He pointed towards the formation of such a secular identity in his representation of a woman, as I pointed out, whose rationality is not borrowed from the West, that is Gora's mother. The other such figure was for him Lalan Phakir, a baul with whose song the novel begins. This baul belonged to the Sufi tradition. Tagore came across him in his tour of the rural East Bengal and did all he could to popularize and even adopt his song that blended Hinduism and Islam. In his songs of body lore, I apologize that I cannot sing these beautiful songs to you. However, I will read a small rendering of one of his verses. The Hindus and Muslims are sundered into two. The Muslims aspire to their particular heaven or Behesh. The Hindus dwell on theirs called Swarga. Who cares for them? God is deserting your temple as you amuse yourself by blowing conch shells and ringing bells. Nor was Lalan an isolated phenomenon. Tagore's reading of Indian history could trust the oppositional voice of the medieval sons for keeping the society mobile and alive. To quote, the message of the spiritual freedom and unity of man mainly sprang from the obscured strata, the community where belonged the castes that were despised. One of them being a Mohammedan weaver, one a cobbler, and several coming from the ranks of society whose touch would pollute the drinking water of the respectable section of the Hindus. As the class-based nationalist agenda increasingly reified and homogenized identity founded on religion, Tagore searched for a secularism that would not allow itself to be appropriated by such an orthodoxy. Despite his class limitations, Tagore's legacy of a strenuous search for secular democratic forms certainly paved the way for later political movements in Bengal, with which I had begun. The women's movement of the second wave that took on from many of the impulses of the less democratic movement in India, particularly the protest movements against Indira Gandhi's emergency, are in the danger of being set adrift from politics and sink into either culture in an ahistorical, encapsulated form that relies in a blind way upon cultural forms, from which the traces of the material everyday struggle of women and men have been gouged out. These will happily talk about women's mythical empowerment, standing for a pure tradition, such as the recent hooligans against the so-called act of polluting the pure image of the Hindu upper caste widows displayed. Or there is the manipulative world of development that is talking of empowering women in the interest of freeing them for the market without addressing the class question, which has to accompany feminist interrogation of poverty. The way some of the older patterns of colonial exploitation are making a reappearance in the new dispensation of globalization, women's movement has to mount a special vigil upon the politics of empowerment that is pesticized by the indigenism of culture and the globalizing signals of development. It is not easy, but worth a try. Thank you.